lovely. No, I'm just kidding. So I'm going to say up front, I'm not a lawyer. And just so you know, I'm not a lawyer because a lot of what my presentation is talking about is lawyering. So if you have lawyering questions, I'm going to call on Alan to help me out, and Brian Citro when he actually gets a plane and he comes on over here on Thursday. But any other questions, I will gladly take on. And of course, we're going to talk about TB. I know this morning a woman who I had seen at a previous workshop came up to me and she goes, Colleen, oh, you're the TB person, because there's just one. There's so few of us in the world working on anything related to TB, human rights, TB, gender, TB, and key populations that we become known as the TB people. But let me start. So really, though, the message from this morning is really going to be about, in TB, the need to be proactive, because we can't wait until criminal laws and de facto criminalization are used frequently against people with TB like they have with HIV. And so we're in a place right now where we're actually trying to work against that. We're trying to stop that from happening because we don't want those maps up in a few years where we're looking at TB. When I was with Treatment Action Group in New York a few years ago, a lot of those states that Edwin showed in the US who were actually changing their HIV criminalization laws, we had to work really hard to try and stop others from criminalizing TB. And so it took a lot of advocacy for us to do that, but we managed in a lot of states, not in some others, you know, the obvious ones like Texas and others in the South, but we did manage to do them in quite a few states. So when it comes to TB, what are we actually talking about when it comes to the application of criminal laws against people with TB? So these are those laws that obviously, as Edwin and Michaela talked about, they're the laws that specifically target people with TB, or criminal laws of general applicability. So where we can use laws in other areas against people who have TB. So I'm going to talk about criminalization of TB transmission or exposure, criminalization of behavior or identities of TB key vulnerable and underserved populations, de facto criminalization of TB. We'll take on impact of TB criminalization tomorrow morning, and then we'll look at the way forward. So I have to say, one thing is that Brian Citro is actually from the Pritzker School of Law in Northwestern, and he finds these fabulous students who do enormous amounts of research for us. And he hasn't told me the name of the student, but I'd like to say, whoever you are, thank you, because they took 180 pages of research and brought it down into a page and a half so I could distill it into a PowerPoint. So thank you to this person, and when we find out the name, we'll definitely put it on here. I'm telling you, we all want that person. I'm like, where'd you find this person? But when it comes to TB, criminalization of TB transmission or exposure, what we're really talking about are TB-specific laws. So do they exist? Not as far as we know, and we did a global legislation survey that was done in 2016, and we couldn't find anything. General criminal laws are actually applied to TB transmission. Has this happened? Not as far as we know again. In your bags, if you checked in, you got a hard copy of the TB case compendium. These are all the cases that we knew of when this came out last year. And we couldn't find any that actually applied to TB transmission. We did find some laws, some sections of laws where it could apply. So for example, in the UK, Offences Against the Person Act of 1861, there were some sections that may criminalize TB transmission, which could also then be applied to HIV, for example. So we also did find that where there are some laws that applied to general laws that could be applied to HIV criminalization and transmission, they could also be applied to TB. So I've given, and don't be afraid of all the text in here, I'm not gonna read everything, but these are also just for you to have these references so that you know where this information can be found. So causality, when it comes to, again, what Edwin and Michaela were talking about is, knowingly transmitting HIV. Well, with TB, 2 billion people carry latent TB infection. How do we know when anyone got their latent TB infection? How do we know when it became active TB disease? So if in one household, all of us, when I lived in Thailand, for example, everybody in Thailand, I'm going to say everybody, but a lot of people in Thailand have latent TB infection. It's just a big transmission area for latent TB infection. And so, but can we say that we all in the same household got it at the same time? No, of course not, because some of us went to work in different environments, others went to school, others went to work, volunteered in an orphanage. We don't know at what point you could have gotten latent TB infection. And so to say that, to find that direct transmission is really difficult. If let's say 10 of us in this room got TB, we could probably do genome testing to find out exactly what that TB is, which pieces of bacteria, which mutation, but we couldn't tell if we all gave it to each other and who did that, right? So we don't have that at all. We cannot prove person-to-person transmission for tuberculosis. And again, back to the mens rea, that literally the guilty mind in Latin. What standard could be used? Was it intentionality, recklessness, knowledge, strict liability? We don't have that information. However, if you're in a prison and they're not doing anything in that prison to protect you from getting TB, so it's a congregate setting, they're not protecting you, they're not putting in any infection control measures, they're not providing preventive therapy for people who have HIV, and they're not putting people who have active TB disease into isolation, so separate cells, then we can look at TB transmission. But we couldn't tell who I got that TB from in a prison, but we just know that I got it in the prison. We have criminalization of behavior or identities of TB key populations. So TB key populations, we actually call them key, vulnerable, and underserved populations because they're not the same as in HIV. So in TB, we have about 10.4 million people who get active TB disease every year. And we only find about 6.1 million people. So we have about 4.3 million people who have active TB disease, who are sick, who potentially not being diagnosed and not given treatment. And we know with TB, if you give someone treatment, within 2 weeks, they are no longer infectious. So if you're not on treatment, you're infectious and transmitting TB. And out of that 4.3 million people that were missing, most of them are key, vulnerable, and underserved populations. So they're not drivers of the epidemic, but they're those huge parts of undiagnosed active TB disease. And they could be people who use drugs. So we have criminal laws that prohibit drug use that are then used against people when they have TB. So for example, in parts of Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, they're actually using these drug laws to prohibit people getting their treatment for TB or from getting opioid substitution therapy and TB treatment at the same time, for example. These are standards in care that are not being applied. Mobile populations. So we're talking about refugees, internally displaced peoples, and migrants who are not allowed to go to a different country if you have TB. You have to do chest x-rays. For example, I live in Australia. You have to have chest x-rays to show you do not have TB and then show I don't have TB if I had it in the past. So all these kinds of laws that can be applied to immigrants and undocumented migrants who have TB because they're actually pushed out of the health system. So they're not accessing those services and those can be used against them. You have laws against the rural and urban poor, criminal laws around debt, which can be used then against people who have TB. Of course, Michaela and Edwin talked about the people who have HIV and the criminalization of HIV and how that impacts them. Healthcare workers, their lack of infection control measures. Here in South Africa, you have TB Proof, which was, it's an organization of healthcare workers, doctors and clinicians, laboratory people who all came together and realized, nurses, who all came together and said, hey, we're getting TB just by going to work, and we're not being protected. But there are also laws that can criminalize that. A lot of people actually who do get TB in the health profession are fired. So they're not allowed to work. Minors are fired, for example. So we have to take a look at all of those sorts of the other laws that can then be applied to people with TB. de facto criminalization of TB also includes the civil or administrative laws and regulations that are punitive, discriminatory, arbitrary, or abusive when they're applied to people with TB. And that includes imprisonment and fines, and those that generate and perpetuate TB stigma. So the great example is Kenya, which Alan and Tim will talk to you about later, where people were put into prison for non-adherence to their treatment. So people are being penalized for not adhering to their treatment, but they've got shitty programs. Right? So if you don't have an adequate program that will actually enable someone to get to a journey of diagnosis, treatment to cure, because TB is curable, then we are not doing something correct. But people are being penalized for that. There's also the Lagos State Public Health Act, which has some provisions that can also apply. That's included in something I'll talk about a little later, the legal environment assessments. That's how we actually learned about the Lagos state law. So there's also the involvement of law enforcement officers, institutions, or mechanisms used in enforcing civil or administrative laws and policies. And I think the Kenya example is a great one of that. And so we'll be able to see exactly how they utilized it. And we're also looking at, again, an example is that Lagos State Public Health Law, which was a civil or administrative law or regulation that established and authorizes use of coercive measures against people with TB. So once we started looking at all the different policies and guidelines that weren't specifically TB, we found a lot of these that could actually criminalize people with TB. And there's also that application of these laws or policies that generates or perpetuates stigma. And Anand Grover, who, when he was the UN Special Rapporteur on HIV, on health, he made these statements where he showed that stigma generated by use of criminal law in the areas of health, and he specifically related it to HIV and sexual reproductive health. And these, again, can be applied to TB as well. And so we have to look at what are the practices involved in the application of these laws or policies that generate TB-related stigma. And these can be also considered de facto criminalization. And so these are things, when we're talking about TB and stigma, it's not just the soft issue that we need to think about, because it could be potentially have this criminalization aspect. So the other part of this could be where people do not have the rights, they're not provided legal aid, for example, so they don't have the procedural rights, guarantees, or protections provided to the criminally accused. So a good example of this would be minors who are fired for having TB and do not have access to legal aid to be able to help them. So I'm going to skip these impact of TB criminalization because we'll talk about that tomorrow morning. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the way forward, because one of the big issues we have is a lack of research and data. And this is really urgently needed if we're to work right now on TB specific issues to prevent it from going down the HIV route. So legal environment assessments, UNDP, and when I was at the Stop TB Partnership, we actually developed a legal environment assessment tool for TB. Now in Africa, where we have such high rates of co-infections, it doesn't make sense to do an HIV LEA, legal environment assessment, and a TB one separately. If we have countries of high co-infection, they should be done together, because at the end of the day, it's one person. So it's not Colleen who has TB and Colleen who has HIV and Colleen who needs, sexual reproductive health services. It's me, a person. And so we need to be able to address those issues as that person. So in this region, I really would push for HIV and TB LEAs to be conducted together. We've actually defined some of the key vulnerable and underserved populations. There are now 10 guides, and these are the global high-level groups that we've discovered in TB where we're missing the most number of cases, or where criminalization could be applied in some of the most horrific ways we've seen. These are all available on the Stop TB Partnership website. And what we did was when we had defined these, we wanted countries to be able to then determine what their own key vulnerable and underserved populations are, because they're not the same. Here in South Africa, it might be minors, healthcare workers, people living with HIV. In Korea or in Latvia, those don't apply. They don't have mining, for example. They have low rates of people living with HIV. So we have to take into consideration what that country, what are the actual data in that country that will enable us to then understand who our key populations are and what services we should be able to provide. And that's what these guides are doing, as well as another document called Data for Key Populations for TB. So why do these legal environment assessments for TB? Because they identify the populations that are particularly impacted. Without them, we wouldn't know about a lot of these laws and policies and guidance that are sitting in other places that are not health related. So while I was at Stop TB, we actually rolled this LEA out in 7 countries. Kenya is one of them, Nigeria, where else? It was Kenya, Nigeria, anywhere, and Tanzania. We're here in Africa. And I'm hoping that Stop TB will actually put these on their website so everyone can access them. And then you'll have a better understanding of what's going on in your countries. But where you don't have them, I'm so glad to see Marguerite here from the Global Fund, and also, I've totally forgotten your name in the wonderful jacket from UNDP. David, that's right, from UNDP, because you have an opportunity to get these included in grants. You have an opportunity to make sure that in all high burden countries, this is included. And not just doing an assessment, but looking at then what we do with the recommendations. How do we then apply those? And now you have an enormous resource in this room of people who can actually do them in this region. So just putting it out there, you might want to talk to each other about it. But legal environment assessments help us review the laws, the policies, and the practices that serve as barriers to access for a lot of these populations. It also helps us analyze human rights violations. In TB, we first started truly talking about TB and human rights about 3 years ago. So, we're operating like we're in 1963, kind of like a lot of our governments. But, we're moving fast now. We're trying to really encourage people to take action and take action fast. And that's one of the reasons that we really pushed for TB to be included in these workshops. And the great thing is that everybody who was working on this regional grant recognized that so early and allowed us to come in. But what would TB legal environment assessments get us? Where can they get us? Ultimately, it's an incorporation of a rights-based and gender-based approach to TB. Because someone who has TB, it's not just about diagnosing and treating them, because a lot of the times their families are impacted, their communities are impacted, and how do we respond to that in an appropriate way? So again, I just wanted to mention the TB case compendium because it is the first time we've ever done this in TB where we have all these cases. And you can see it's probably one of the fastest things you'll ever read because there's so few cases that we've actually ever taken to court. So, but it's a great resource, and I just want to thank Brian Citro, who actually led this work for Stop TB, and of course Alan at KELIN, who did the same. But it will give you some really good examples of the cases and some of the responses. The other tools I wanted to quickly mention that you might be interested in are the Data for Action for key vulnerable and underserved populations, and then the TB HIV gender assessment tool. Because when we look at criminalization, a lot of the times we also forget that gender aspect. And we need to be able to bring that in when we're looking at who's not getting access to services or why they're being prohibited from those services. So I'll just leave you with this. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Desmond Tutu said that, and I firmly agree. And today, in the environment that we're in, where civil society is being harassed, and actually more and more laws are coming governments are producing more and more laws where they're trying to silence civil society, where they're trying to silence key vulnerable and underserved populations. If we're silent, we are that oppressor. We've become those Germans in World War II who sat back and said, I couldn't do anything, when actually we could. Because at the end of the day, this is where we want to get to. Thank you so much for listening.